was betrayed, he said one of the most significant statements of all time. Matthew records it this way. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." This is one of the most significant statements of all time, because what Jesus says here has huge implications for not only us, but for the entire world. And I really want to break down why, in our last session together, the significance of both the bread and the blood in this statement. Let's start with the bread. Jesus says, "Take this bread," and he breaks it, and he says, "This is my body." Now, in order to make bread, you have to take the wheat, you have to break down the kernels, and you have to crush them, you have to destroy them, you have to mill them, and you have to put them into a powder. And Jesus is referencing this because he says, "This is my body." And one translation says, "This is my body, which is going to be broken for you." Now, for us Americans, this is like kind of a foreign concept, because when we think of bread, we think of bread. Nice, soft loaf that you can buy at the store, right? But when Jesus breaks the bread, that's not really what he's talking about here. In fact, the bread that Jesus would have been eating would have been matzah bread, or bread made without yeast. And this is a kosher piece of matzah bread. And the reason why they did this at Passover was because they were getting ready to move. Back in the book of Exodus, it literally says when you sit down to eat, make sure that there's no yeast in the house. Make sure you make bread with no yeast. Have your shoes on, have your cloak ready, and be ready to go. Because there was this urgent matter, and there's this big moment. Jesus is having a Passover meal, and I imagine that the very same kind of feeling is happening as he's sitting with his disciples. And he holds up a piece of bread, right? And he says, this is my body that's going to be broken for you. A little bit different than this, right? A little different. Because there's going to be a physical breaking of Jesus' body. Then he says, he grabs the cup, and he holds up the cup and he says, "This is the blood of a new covenant, which is going to be spilled out for the forgiveness of sins." And this is huge for a couple of reasons. One, blood was a huge deal in the Old Testament. Leviticus, the book of Leviticus puts it this way. "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." Blood is a huge deal. It was blood that was painted over the doors to protect the Jewish homes from losing their firstborn child during the plagues of Egypt. It was blood of animals that was sacrificed to appease God, and they were burned, and the blood was spilt so that ultimately people could be atoned for and their sins could be forgiven. And then it was blood that was brought in by the high priest, and it was brought into the most holy place, and it was sprinkled onto the altar that they had there so that people could be forgiven of their sins. Blood has always had forgiving power, but Jesus says something very significant here. He says, "But this is the blood of a new covenant." The writer of Hebrews says it best. Look at this. "He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from transgressions committed under the first covenant." In short, Jesus paid the ultimate price, and he was the final sacrifice, and he was the final amount of blood that needed to be spilled so that God could forgive us of our sins. Jesus takes that place, and by the spilling of his blood and by the breaking of his body, we can have a right relationship with God, and we can be forgiven for sins forever. And that is why we celebrate. That's why we join together on Easter Sunday. That's why we sing songs about him conquering the grave and him showing his power and him coming off of that cross, right? And we celebrate this because Jesus was the final sacrifice. So here's the significance. When Jesus says, "This is my body and this is my blood," he was creating a brand new mode of salvation for people that was going to be for the rest of time. We don't have to sacrifice goats anymore. We don't have to sacrifice bulls anymore because you're not a goat and you're not a bull. But Jesus, being man and spilling that blood for us, provided the equal sacrifice so that ultimately we could be forgiven. Today, I want to end our time together by celebrating what Jesus did for us, but through the breaking of his body and by the spilling of his blood. He did something extraordinary for us. And I want us to end our time together just focusing on that. So I hope you have a fantastic Easter, and I hope you enjoy this little presentation.